Appeal to Tradition 1, Family of Fallacies. One fallacious way to argue that something is true or good is to make this inference by appealing to tradition. When the debate over same-sex marriage was at its peak, this sort of poor reasoning was commonly deployed in an effort to defend what some asserted to be traditional marriage. While that debate is largely settled, the appeal to tradition is still employed to defend what some people see as traditions worth defending, such as traditional gender roles and traditional religious values. The obvious problem with this approach is that it involves a fallacy, a bad argument in which the premises fail to logically support the conclusion. As to why people would use a fallacy, some reasons include not realizing it is a fallacy, not having any good arguments to use, or knowing that a fallacy can be far more persuasive than a logically good argument. Rather than engage in the endless task of addressing the multitude of specific fallacious appeals to tradition, I will focus on the fallacy itself, in the hopes that it'll provide people with the tools needed to recognize and defend against such appeals. I'll go beyond merely describing the fallacy, and do something of a deep dive in upcoming videos. To begin, we should consider two relatives of the appeal to tradition. These are the appeal to belief and the appeal to common practice. The appeal to belief fallacy occurs when a person infers that a claim is true simply because all or most people believe the claim. It has the following general pattern. Premise 1, all or most people believe that claim X is true. Conclusion, therefore X is true. This line of reasoning is fallacious because the fact that many people believe a claim does not, in general, serve as evidence that the claim is true. But you might be thinking, surely there are exceptions, and you would be right. There are some cases when the fact that many or all people accept a claim as true is an indication that it is true. Avoiding the fallacy in such cases does require including this as a premise. To use an example of where belief indicates truth, imagine you're visiting my home state of Maine, and you're interested in going fishing. And you're told by several residents you see fishing that they believe that people older than 16 need to buy a fishing license to legally fish. Barring reasons to doubt these people, you have good reason to believe their claim because they most likely know the law and are probably not lying to you. Now, they could be wrong, but it would not be unreasonable to accept that they make this claim, they seem to believe it, so probably true. In fact, this would be a good appeal to authority as opposed to a fallacious one. Now, there are also cases in which what people believe not only merely indicates the truth, but actually determines the truth of a claim. Now, avoiding the fallacy in such cases does require including this as a premise. You have to, do the work. That's what would make it non-fallacious. For example, the truth of claims about manners seems to depend entirely on what people believe to be good manners. The meaning of words also seem to rest on belief. Words, in a practical sense, mean what most people believe they mean. Now, to get a bit philosophical, some philosophers argue that ethical and aesthetic claims being things about art and beauty, they claim that these two areas, ethics and aesthetics, fall into the category of cases in which belief makes things true. For example, those who embrace what's called moral or ethical relativism argue that what is good and bad is determined by the beliefs of a culture. Those who embrace aesthetic relativism, typically about beauty, contend that beauty is determined in the same way. It depends on the beliefs of the culture. Now, these theories cannot simply be assumed to be true without committing another fallacy, that of begging the question. Now to the other close relative of appeal to tradition, the appeal to common practice. While appeal to belief involves what people believe, the appeal to common practice involves what people do. It occurs when someone concludes that an action is correct or right simply because it is, or merely alleged to be, commonly done. It has the following form. Premise 1, X is a common action. Conclusion, therefore X is correct, moral, justified, reasonable, etc. Now this is a fallacy. This is bad logic, because the mere fact that most people do something does not automatically make it correct, moral, justified, or reasonable. But once again, you might think, but perhaps there are some exceptions or cases that look like common practice but are not. And you would be right. As with appeal to belief, there are philosophers who argue that there can be arguments from common practice that are not fallacious. Going back to moral relativism, you could look at that not just in terms of belief, but also in terms of practices. So if someone's a moral relativist, they could hold that morality is relative to the practices of a culture. So if what is moral is in fact determined by what is commonly practiced by a culture, then a non-fallacious argument could be constructed using that as a premise to make the connection between action and being good. So if it's true that what people commonly do is good, and so this is something people commonly do, then it would follow that it would be good. That would be logically a good argument. Now, of course, one has to do the work to establish the premises, but that's another matter. Now, people sometimes mistake an appeal for fair play to be an appeal to common practice. For example, a woman working in an office might say that the men who do the same amount and quality of work that she does get paid more than she does. So it'd be right for her to get paid the same as them. Now, this argument does not rest on the practice, the pay, being a common one. Rather, it's an appeal to the principle of relevant difference. On this principle, two people can only be treated differently if and only if there's a relevant difference between them. Going back to the work example, it's pretty clearly morally acceptable to pay people differently for work of different quality, quantity, etc. But it would not be acceptable to pay people differently for the same quality and quantity, etc. of work simply because one person is male and the other person is female. Now, as that example would probably indicate, there is considerable debate about what differences are relevant. There are those, of course, who would contend that a male should be paid more because they're male, and that a female should be paid less because they're female. So that is the appeal to common practice. Now, you might be wondering what the appeal to belief and the appeal to common practice have to do with the appeal to tradition. Roughly put, the appeal to tradition fallacy involves arguing that something is true or right because it has been believed or done for a long time, or both. As such, the fallacy occurs when it is assumed that something is better or correct simply because it is older, traditional, or has always been done or always been believed. This sort of bad reasoning has the following form. Premise 1, X is old or traditional. That is to say, believed or done a long time. Conclusion, therefore X is correct or better than the new or non-traditional. Now, this sort of reasoning is fallacious because the age of something does not automatically make it correct or better than something newer. This can be made quite obvious by the following kind of silly example. The theory that witches or demons cause disease is far older than the theory that microorganisms cause diseases. But to infer the theory about witches and demons must be true because it's older, would clearly be bad logic. Now, while you should avoid falling for the appeal to tradition, it is equally important to avoid falling for the appeal to novelty. This fallacy occurs when one infers that something is correct or better simply because it is new or non-traditional. This sort of bad reasoning has the following form. Premise 1, X is new or non-traditional. Conclusion, therefore X is correct or better than the old or traditional. This sort of bad reasoning is fallacious because the novelty or newness of something does not automatically make it correct or better than something old. To use a silly example, if someone just created the earthworm diet that involves eating only earthworms, it obviously does not follow that this is better than more traditional diets. As a general rule, the age or traditionality, or lack thereof, of something provides no evidence for or against its truth or goodness. In the next video, I'll get into some deeper philosophical analysis of the appeal to tradition and why it is logically defective.